Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the ancient origins of Dia de los Muertos, a festival so intertwined with death that the Aztecs dedicated an entire month to it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about how celebrating death required you to slice open your earlobes, fast for days, and dance until exhaustion in honor of ancestors who might curse you if you got it wrong. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters, and please let me know in the comments where you are checking in from tonight. Now, settle in. Maybe turn those lights down low, put a fan on for that gentle hum. Let's journey back nearly 3,000 years to when honoring the dead wasn't just tradition, it was survival. Imagine waking up in the pre-dawn darkness of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent Aztec capital, around the year 1450. The air is thick and humid, carrying the scent of copal incense mixed with the ever-present smell of the city's canals. You are not nobility, you are not a priest. You are an ordinary member of the community, a farmer perhaps, or a craftsperson, and today marks the beginning of Michaelhuitantli, the little feast of the dead. For the next 20 days, your life will revolve entirely around death, remembrance, and ritual obligation. The month dedicated to the dead, which the Aztecs observed during what we would call late July and early August, was not optional. This was not a gentle, contemplative remembrance like modern celebrations might be. This was exhausting, physically demanding, emotionally draining, and filled with specific requirements that, if neglected, could bring misfortune upon your entire family. The Aztecs believed the dead traveled to various afterlives depending on how they died, not how they lived, and during this sacred month, the boundary between the living world and the land of the dead grew thin. The deceased could return. They were watching, and they expected to be honored properly. Your first task, as dawn breaks over the Great Pyramid, is preparation, not of food, not yet, but of yourself. The festival demands ritual purity, and for you, this means fasting. Not complete abstention from food, but a restriction so severe it makes your stomach clench with hunger even as the sun rises. You are permitted only a small amount of ground maize mixed with water, consumed once at midday. No salt, no chili peppers, those beloved staples of every meal you normally eat. No meat, no beans, nothing with flavor or substance. This fast will continue for days, and you can already feel your body weakening, your thoughts becoming fuzzy at the edges. But fasting is only the beginning. You must also perform bloodletting, the sacred act of auto-sacrifice that the gods demand. In your small home, with its earthen floor and walls made of adobe, you retrieve the maguey spine, a long, wickedly sharp thorn from the agave plant. Your hands shake slightly, not from fear exactly, you have done this before, but from the knowledge of what comes next. You pierce your earlobe, pushing the spine through the soft flesh until blood wells up and runs down your neck. The pain is sharp, immediate, a bright burning sensation that makes your eyes water. You catch the blood on pieces of bark paper, sacred offerings that will later be burned so the smoke can carry your sacrifice to the realm of the dead. Some mourners pierce their tongues instead, drawing cords covered in thorns through the wound repeatedly. You have seen men nearly faint from this practice, their mouths filled with blood, their voices lost for days afterward. The physical discomfort of fasting and bloodletting would be bearable, perhaps, if they were the only requirements. But the Festival of the Dead is also a festival of vigil. You are expected to maintain watch, to stay awake for extended periods. Gathering with your family and neighbors around the small altar you have constructed in your home. This altar, your ofrenda, is both simple and profound. You have swept the space clean, scattered marigold petals, the bright orange flowers the Aztecs call cempasúchil, which guide the spirits home with their vivid color and pungent scent. You have placed offerings of tamales, the special ones made without salt, in observance of the fast, and small clay vessels filled with pulque, the fermented agave drink that the dead supposedly crave. But maintaining this altar means constant work. The flowers wilt quickly in the heat. The food attracts insects. The copal incense must be kept burning continuously, filling your small home with smoke that makes your eyes sting and your throat roar. You take turns with your family members, watching through the night, because it is believed that the spirits of dead children, honored during the first 10 days of Michaeluatontli, will arrive at any moment. These tiny souls, children who died in infancy or were never born, are thought to be the most eager to return, the most innocent, and also the most easily frightened away if the welcoming is not done properly. Sleep becomes a luxury you can barely afford. You doze sitting up, jolting awake when your head drops forward, worried you have missed some crucial moment. During the day, there is no rest either. You must work, because life does not stop for ritual. Your crops still need tending, your craft still needs attention, your family still needs to survive. But you are weak from fasting, lightheaded from blood loss, exhausted from lack of sleep, and everywhere you turn, there are more obligations. The community gatherings are perhaps the most demanding aspect of the festival. Every evening, as the sun sets behind the great temple pyramid, you join the procession to the local temple precinct. Here, hundreds of your neighbors gather, all of them as haggard and worn as you feel. The priests, resplendent in their ritual garments, despite the blood caked in their hair from their own more extreme acts of sacrifice, lead the community in song and dance. But this is not the joyful celebration you might imagine. The dances are long, repetitive, physically exhausting. You move in circles for hours, your feet raising dust from the packed earth of the plaza, your voice joining in the rhythmic chants that honor Mictlantecutli, the lord of the land of the dead, and his wife Mictosacidal, the lady of the dead. Your legs ache. Your throat is parched because you have had almost nothing to drink. The other dancers around you sometimes stumble, caught by neighbors before they fall. An elderly woman near you is weeping quietly as she dances, tears streaming down her weathered face, overcome with grief for a son lost to disease years ago. A young man, perhaps honoring his first child who did not survive birth, dances with such fervor that blood from his self-inflicted wounds has soaked through his simple cotton tunic. The priests watch everything, their faces stern, making sure no one slacks in their devotion, because the gods are always watching too, and displeasure from the divine can mean drought, famine, defeat in war. When you finally stumble home near midnight, you cannot simply collapse into sleep. You must check the altar again, refresh the incense, make sure the offerings remain undisturbed. And then, just as you begin to drift off on your woven mat, you hear it, the sound you have been both anticipating and dreading. It is the cry of an infant, thin and reedy, echoing in the darkness outside your home. Your heart races. Is it a living child? Or is it one of the dead infants returning to visit? The Aztecs believe that children who died before they could speak might not remember their way home, that they wander lost in the darkness, crying. You rise, exhausted as you are, and step outside with a small torch, looking for any sign of a spirit child who needs guidance. You find nothing but shadows and the distant sounds of the city settling into an uneasy rest. But you cannot shake the feeling that something is there, just beyond the edge of your vision. This is the psychological weight of the festival. The constant awareness of death's presence. The belief that the departed are near, and watching and judging how well you remember them. As the festival progresses into its second 10-day period, Huitl, the great feast of the dead, the intensity only increases. Now you honor the adult dead, those who died ordinary deaths from illness, old age, accidents. These spirits require more elaborate offerings. You have saved for weeks, perhaps months, to afford the proper goods, special foods that you prepare despite your own hunger, your hands trembling with weakness as you grind maize, shape tamales, prepare the dishes the deceased loved in life. Clothing items, carefully woven or traded for at considerable cost. Tools, toys, personal items that marked the identity of the dead person you are honoring. If you are honoring a parent, the expectations are even higher. You are required to commission or create an image, perhaps a clay figurine or a carved representation, that will serve as a temporary vessel for the returning spirit. You dress this figure in miniature versions of the deceased's favorite clothing. You place it in the position of honor on the altar, surrounded by everything they loved. And you speak to it, not metaphorically, but literally, as if your dead mother or father is sitting there before you, telling them about the year that has passed, asking for their blessing, their guidance, their forgiveness for any ways you may have failed to live up to their expectations. The emotional toll of this is immense. Grief is not a private affair in Aztec culture during the Festival of the Dead. It is public, communal, performed and displayed. You are expected to mourn visibly, to show your sorrow through tears, through your weakened body, through your dedication to the exhausting rituals. If you do not appear sufficiently grief-stricken, your neighbors will notice. They will wonder if you truly loved the deceased. They might gossip that you are disrespectful, that you will bring bad luck upon the community. And then there are the children, if you have them. They must participate too, learning the rituals, staying awake for the vigils, fasting according to their age and ability. You watch your young daughter struggle to stay awake, her small face pinched with hunger, and your heart aches. But this is necessary, you tell yourself. She must learn. She must understand that death is not an ending, but a transition, that the dead remain part of the family, that honoring them is as important as any other duty in life. Around the 10th day of your observance, as you stand once more in the temple plaza, barely able to keep your eyes open, barely able to stand without swaying, you might wonder why this matters so much. Why does honoring the dead require such suffering from the living? But then you remember the stories, the warnings passed down through generations. You remember the tale of the family who neglected the festival one year, who decided they were too busy with the harvest to properly observe. Their crops failed the next year. Disease came to their home. The father died young. The community understood it was the anger of the neglected dead, exacting revenge for being forgotten. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to what it was really like to observe this ancient festival of death. The physical environment of the festival only adds to your misery. It is late summer, the height of the rainy season in central Mexico. The humidity is oppressive, making every breath feel thick and heavy. Rain comes in sudden, violent downpours that drench you as you travel to and from the temple, that threaten to extinguish the sacred fires and incense on your home altar. You must constantly tend to everything, protecting the offerings from the elements, making sure nothing is ruined, because a ruined offering is no offering at all, and the spirits will notice. The mosquitoes are relentless, breeding in the standing water that collects in every depression, every canal. They swarm around you as you try to maintain your vigil, biting exposed skin. And you are not allowed to slap them away vigorously, because such violent movement would be considered disrespectful in the sacred space of your altar. You endure the itching, the welts rising on your arms and legs, just one more discomfort layered upon all the others. Your clothing, simple cotton that is your only garment, becomes damp with sweat and rain and never fully dries. It chafes, it clings, it smells of smoke and copal and your own unwashed body, because bathing during the festival is restricted, another form of ritual austerity. You become acutely aware of your own physical decline as the days pass. You are thinner, your skin looks greyish, your eyes are hollow. When you catch your reflection in the still water of a canal, you barely recognize yourself. And yet, there are moments of strange transcendence in all this suffering. On the final night of the festival, as you stand with your community for the last great dance, something shifts. Perhaps it is exhaustion, perhaps it is something more, but you feel it, a presence, a thinning of the boundary between worlds. The air seems to shimmer. The smoke from thousands of incense burners rises into the night sky, and for a moment you can almost see shapes in it, forms, faces. The dead are here. They are watching. They are receiving your offerings, your pain, your devotion. When the festival finally ends, when you are released from your obligations and allowed to eat normally again, to sleep properly, to return to regular life, you collapse into an exhausted relief. Your body is weak. It will take days to recover your strength, but you have done it. You have honored the dead as they deserve. You have maintained the cosmic balance. You have ensured that your family will be protected, that the ancestors will continue to watch over you, that death, when it comes for you eventually, will not be a lonely journey into unknown darkness, but a return to the embrace of those who went before. This is what it meant to observe the ancient festival of the dead in Aztec Mexico. Not a cheerful celebration, not a gentle remembrance, but a grueling, physically demanding, emotionally exhausting ordeal that pushed the living to their limits in order to honor those beyond life. The modern Dia de los Muertos, beautiful and meaningful as it is, barely hints at the intensity of what came before. At the suffering the Aztecs believed was necessary to keep death itself satisfied. The social pressure surrounding the festival extends far beyond your immediate family. Your neighbors are watching, judging the quality of your altar, the sincerity of your devotion. In the tight-knit communities of Tenochtitlan, where everyone knows everyone else's business, reputation is everything. A family known for skimping on their festival obligations might find themselves excluded from important community decisions, passed over for favorable marriages, even suspected of harboring dangerous attitudes toward the gods. You cannot afford such social death, so you pour what little resources you have into making sure your observance meets expectations. The marketplace during festival season becomes a strange, almost frantic place. Despite everyone's supposed focus on spiritual matters, there is intense competition for the best offerings. The finest copal incense sells out quickly, as do the most vibrant marigolds. The purest white candles made from beeswax rather than tallow. Merchants, understanding supply and demand perfectly well, raise their prices during this period. You find yourself trading goods you can barely afford to part with, bartering away extra produce or craft work you had hoped to save, all to acquire items for the dead who can no longer use them. The economic burden of properly honoring the deceased can push families to the edge of poverty, yet refusing to pay is unthinkable. There are also the gifts you must prepare for the temple priests. While your own family altar is your primary responsibility, the community temples require offerings as well, and the priests expect contributions from every household. You must set aside a portion of your carefully prepared foods, some of your precious incense, perhaps a small piece of woven cloth, and deliver these to the temple compound. The priests accept your offerings with barely a glance, their faces impassive, and you wonder if your contribution was sufficient, if you have given enough to please both the gods and their earthly representatives. The nights are particularly difficult. Aztec cosmology teaches that darkness is when the forces of death are strongest, when Mictlantecutli walks most freely in the world above. You lie on your mat, trying to rest despite your hunger and exhaustion, and every sound becomes magnified. The scuttling of an insect might be a spirit, the distant howl of a dog, those animals sacred to the journey of the dead, might be an omen. Your culture has taught you to see portents everywhere, to understand that the universe is constantly communicating through signs and symbols, and during the Festival of the Dead, when the barriers between worlds are thin, these signs multiply and intensify. You remember the old woman in your Kalpuli, your neighborhood district, who claimed she saw her dead husband standing in her doorway one night during last year's festival. She said he looked exactly as he did in life, except his eyes were empty, hollow. He said nothing, simply stared at her for a moment before fading like smoke. The story terrified you then, and now, in the dark, you cannot help but think of it. What would you do if one of your own dead appeared? Would you welcome them, or would you be paralyzed with fear, unable to speak, unable to move? The children in the community whisper their own stories, tales of spirit children who play in the plaza at midnight, leaving tiny footprints in the dust that vanish by dawn. Tales of offerings that disappear from altars, not stolen by animals or thieves, but consumed by the dead themselves. You tell yourself these are just stories, ways to make sense of the inexplicable, but in the darkness, with your mind fuzzy from fasting and sleep deprivation, you are not so sure. By the 20th day, you have become a shadow of yourself. Your body has adapted somewhat to the reduced food, but the constant ritual activity, the emotional intensity, the psychological weight of believing yourself surrounded by invisible spirits, all of this has taken a profound toll. You move through the final ceremonies in a kind of trance, your voice hoarse from chanting, your feet bloody from 20 days of dancing on hard-packed earth, your heart heavy with a grief that feels both deeply personal and somehow ancient, collective, as if you are mourning not just your own dead, but all the dead who have ever existed. As you finally drift into sleep, your stomach full of real food for the first time in 20 days, your body aching in a dozen places. You know that next year you will have to do it all over again. The dead never stop watching, the dead never stop expecting, and you, the living, must never stop remembering, no matter the cost. The rise and fall of Mictlantecutli's greatest festival, the Lady of the Dead and the Spanish arrival, the transformation of the Festival of the Dead from an Aztec sacred obligation into what we now know as Dia de los Muertos, is a story of cultural collision, adaptation, survival, and defiance. It is the story of how indigenous belief systems refused to die even when empires fell, how death itself became a weapon of resistance, and how the Spanish conquest of Mexico inadvertently created one of the most enduring and meaningful celebrations in the Americas. To understand this transformation, we must follow the journey from the height of Aztec power through the cataclysmic arrival of Hernan Cortes and into the strange syncretic world of colonial New Spain. In the year 1519, the Festival of the Dead was at the pinnacle of its cultural importance. Tenochtitlan was the largest city in the Americas, home to perhaps 200,000 people, a metropolis of temples, canals, marketplaces, and carefully ordered social hierarchies. The twin festivals of Mictlantecuhtli and Mictlantecuhtli were embedded in the very fabric of Aztec life. part of the intricate calendar system that governed everything from agriculture to warfare to religious ceremony. The goddess Mictlantecuhtli, the Lady of the Dead, presided over these festivals alongside her consort Mictlantecuhtli. She was depicted as a figure with a fleshless jaw, her body adorned with symbols of death, yet she was not viewed with horror but with a kind of respectful familiarity. Death, in the Aztec worldview, was not an ending but a transformation, and Mictlantecuhtli was the guardian of that transition. The festivals had evolved over centuries, possibly originating from even earlier Mesoamerican traditions dating back 2,500 to 3,000 years to the cultures of the Olmec Maya and others who preceded the Aztecs. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-Aztec civilizations also maintained elaborate death cults, buried their dead with offerings meant for the afterlife, and believed in multiple realms where the deceased would journey based on the manner of their death. By the time the Aztec Empire reached its zenith under the rule of Moctezuma II, these ancient practices had been refined, codified, and integrated into the massive religious bureaucracy that controlled Aztec spiritual life. But 1519 was also the year everything changed. In April of that year, Hernán Cortés and his expedition of approximately 600 Spanish conquistadors landed on the coast of Mexico. They were not the first Europeans to arrive. Earlier expeditions had made brief contact, but they were the first to push inland with the explicit goal of conquest. Cortés was a man of ambition and ruthlessness, and he quickly realized that the Aztec Empire, for all its power and sophistication, was vulnerable. Subject peoples resented Aztec rule and the constant demands for tribute. Rival city-states could be turned into allies, and the Aztecs themselves were psychologically unprepared for the kind of total war the Spanish would wage. The conquest of Mexico was not swift. It took 2 years of battles, sieges, political maneuvering, and biological catastrophe in the form of smallpox epidemics that killed millions of indigenous people who had no immunity to European diseases. But by August of 1521, Tenochtitlan had fallen. The great temples were torn down, the palaces were ransacked. The Aztec Empire, which had dominated central Mexico for nearly 2 centuries, ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Moctezuma II was dead, killed in the chaos of the Spanish siege. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured, tortured, and eventually executed. The age of indigenous rule in central Mexico was over. For the Spanish, and particularly for the Catholic missionaries who arrived in waves after the military conquest, the religious practices of the Aztecs were abominations that needed to be eradicated. The festivals honoring the dead, with their bloodletting, their offerings to pagan gods, their multi-day rituals that centered on deities like Mictlantecuhtli and Mictlantecuhtli, were seen as devil worship. The Spanish burned Aztec codices, the intricate painted books that recorded religious ceremonies, historical events, and calendar systems. They destroyed temples and built Catholic churches on top of the ruins, a deliberate symbolic act meant to demonstrate the triumph of Christianity over indigenous spirituality. They banned public performances of Aztec rituals and punished those who continued to practice them openly. The Franciscan friars, who were among the first and most influential missionary orders in New Spain, approached the conversion of indigenous peoples with a combination of genuine religious fervor and pragmatic adaptation. They learned Nahuatl, the Aztec language, so they could preach directly to the people. They created schools to teach indigenous children Catholic doctrine, and they worked to replace Aztec festivals with Christian ones, carefully timing Catholic holy days to coincide with traditional indigenous celebrations in the hope that one would gradually displace the other. It was in this context that the Festival of the Dead began its transformation. The Spanish noted that the Aztec observances occurred in late July and early August, the height of summer. The Catholic calendar had its own death-related observances. All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd, when the Church honored saints and prayed for the souls of the faithful departed. The friars saw an opportunity. They could not stamp out the indigenous impulse to honor the dead. It was too deeply embedded in the culture, too emotionally powerful. But perhaps they could redirect it, channel it into Catholic forms, move it to the November dates, and gradually replace Mictocosciatl with the Virgin Mary, replace Mictocatoli with Catholic concepts of purgatory and heaven. The indigenous people of New Spain, however, had their own plans. Outwardly, they adopted Catholic practices, attending Mass, getting baptized, celebrating Christian holidays. They had little choice. Refusal could mean punishment, social exclusion, or worse. But in private, in their homes and in rural communities far from Spanish oversight, they continued their old practices. They maintained altars to the dead. They made offerings of food and flowers. They told stories about Mictocosciatl and the journey to Mictlan, the underworld. And slowly, carefully, they began to blend the old ways with the new. This process of syncretism, the fusion of different belief systems, created something entirely unique. Indigenous families would attend All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day services at the Catholic Church, then return home to altars that honored the dead in decidedly non-Catholic ways. They used Catholic symbols like crosses and images of saints, but they placed them alongside marigolds, the ancient Aztec flower of the dead. They prayed to God and the Virgin Mary, but they also whispered prayers to the old gods, just in case. They made offerings of pan de muerto, bread of the dead, a Catholic-influenced food, but shaped it and decorated it with symbols that echoed pre-Columbian traditions. Before we continue this remarkable story of cultural survival, take a moment to leave a comment below. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or just check in and let us know how you're doing. Your engagement means everything to us, and we're grateful to have you as part of our little corner of the internet. Now, let's return to the evolution of this festival through the colonial period. The Catholic Church was aware that something was happening, that their indigenous converts were not quite as thoroughly converted as they appeared. Church records from the 16th and 17th centuries are filled with complaints from priests about indigenous people who mixed Christian and pagan practices, who seemed to attend Mass but also maintained suspicious private rituals. The Spanish Inquisition, established in New Spain in 1571, occasionally investigated and punished indigenous people accused of idolatry, of secretly worshipping the old gods. But the Inquisition had limited reach and limited interest in pursuing every instance of folk practice that deviated from official doctrine. As long as indigenous people appeared publicly Christian and paid their tributes, the authorities often looked the other way. This created a space for the Festival of the Dead to evolve. By the early 17th century, November 1st and 2nd had become firmly established as the dates for honoring the deceased in indigenous and mestizo communities throughout Mexico. The summer festivals had been abandoned or moved, but the core practices, the building of home altars, the offerings of food and flowers, the belief that the dead returned to visit the living, all of this survived. The names changed. Mictocosciatl was no longer spoken of openly, but her spirit, her essence as the Lady of the Dead who welcomes souls and guards their memory, persisted in the popular imagination. The Virgin of Guadalupe's apparition to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531 became the foundational miracle of Mexican Catholicism, played a crucial role in this synthesis. Indigenous people embraced the Virgin of Guadalupe with extraordinary devotion, in part because she appeared as a brown-skinned woman who spoke Nahuatl and manifested on a hill that had been sacred to the Aztec goddess Tenensin. The Virgin became a bridge figure, acceptable to the Spanish as proof of successful conversion, but understood by indigenous people as a continuation of their own religious traditions in a new form. In time, the Virgin of Guadalupe would become associated with Dia de los Muertos observances, her image appearing on altars alongside representations of the deceased. The 18th century saw further evolution of the festival, as the colonial caste system created new categories of people: mestizos of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, criollos of pure Spanish blood but born in the Americas, and various other racial classifications. Each group adapted the Festival of the Dead to their own circumstances. Urban mestizo families might celebrate with more Spanish-influenced customs, purchasing elaborate sugar skulls from markets, decorating graves in cemeteries with candles and flowers. Rural indigenous communities maintained practices that looked more like the pre-Columbian observances, with home altars, offerings of traditional foods, and ceremonies conducted in indigenous languages. The sugar skull. Calavera de Azúcar deserves special mention as it became one of the most iconic symbols of Dia de los Muertos during the colonial period. Sugar was introduced to Mexico by the Spanish, who established sugar plantations using enslaved and indigenous labor. The tradition of creating skull-shaped candies decorated with bright icing in elaborate patterns likely emerged in the 17th or 18th century as a fusion of European sugarcraft traditions and indigenous death imagery. The skulls were sometimes inscribed with names, either of the deceased being honored or of the living person receiving the skull as a gift. They were playful, colorful, a way of making death approachable rather than terrifying. In a land where death was everywhere, from disease epidemics to harsh labor conditions to the lingering trauma of conquest, the sugar skull became a way of saying, "We do not fear you, death, we acknowledge you, we even celebrate you." The independence movements of the early 19th century, which eventually freed Mexico from Spanish colonial rule in 1821, brought new significance to Dia de los Muertos. The war for independence was brutal, lasting from 1810 to 1821 and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. In the aftermath, as Mexico struggled to forge a national identity distinct from Spain, cultural practices that blended indigenous and Catholic elements became sources of pride rather than shame. Dia de los Muertos, with its unique fusion of pre-Columbian and European traditions, began to be seen as authentically Mexican, something that set Mexico apart from both Spain and the United States. Writers and artists of the 19th century played crucial roles in romanticizing and popularizing Dia de los Muertos. José Guadalupe Posada, the famous printmaker, created his iconic calavera images in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Skeleton figures dressed in contemporary clothing, often satirizing the upper classes and political figures. Posada's most famous creation, La Calavera Catrina, a skeleton woman wearing an elaborate European-style hat, became an enduring symbol of the holiday. She represented the idea that death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth or status, a democratizing force that strips away social pretensions. La Catrina was simultaneously a critique of Mexicans who aspired to European sophistication while abandoning their own cultural roots, and a celebration of death as the great equalizer. By the early 20th century, Dia de los Muertos had become thoroughly woven into Mexican national identity. The post-revolutionary government, which came to power after the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, actively promoted indigenous heritage and mestizo culture as the foundation of Mexican identity. Dia de los Muertos fit perfectly into this nationalist narrative. It was distinctly Mexican, practiced nowhere else in quite the same way, and it represented the survival and adaptation of indigenous culture in the face of centuries of oppression. The festival that emerged from this long, complex history was no longer exactly what the Aztecs had practiced, but it was not simply a Catholic observance either. It was something new, a genuinely syncretic tradition that honored the dead through a unique combination of pre-Columbian and Christian elements. Families built elaborate ofrendas in their homes, decorating them with marigolds, candles, sugar skulls, pan de muerto, and photographs of the deceased. They visited cemeteries on November 1st and 2nd, cleaning and decorating graves, holding all-night vigils, sharing food and stories. They believed that the spirits of the dead returned during these days, drawn by the offerings and the love of the living, and that this annual reunion was essential for maintaining the bonds between the living and the dead. The story of how the Festival of the Dead survived conquest, adapted to colonialism, and emerged as Dia de los Muertos is ultimately a story about the resilience of culture. The Spanish tried to erase indigenous religion, but they could not erase the human need to remember and honor those who have died. The Aztec Empire fell, but the practices it had developed for connecting with the dead found new forms, new expressions, new meanings. Mictacacayatl, the Lady of the Dead, may no longer be worshipped by name, but her spirit lives on in every ofrenda, every marigold petal, every sugar skull decorated with a loved one's name. Death could not kill the Festival of the Dead. Conquest could not conquer the human impulse to remember. And in that survival, in that adaptation, lies one of the most profound examples of cultural continuity in human history. The transformation was not without its costs. Much was lost in the centuries of suppression and adaptation. The precise rituals described in destroyed codices, the specific prayers and chants that once honored Mictantecutli, the exact symbolism of Aztec death imagery. Much of this detailed knowledge vanished forever. The festival that survived was a shadow of its former self in some ways, simplified, altered, stripped of some of its original meanings, yet, in other ways, it grew richer. The syncretism that created modern Dia de los Muertos added layers of meaning that the purely Aztec festival lacked. The incorporation of Catholic concepts of heaven and purgatory, the addition of new symbols like sugar skulls and pan de muerto, the fusion of European artistic traditions with indigenous ones, all of this created something more complex, more adaptably, more able to speak to the diverse populations that would come to embrace it. Regional variations emerged across Mexico, each area developing its own distinctive Dia de los Muertos traditions. In Oaxaca, families created elaborate sand tapestries in cemeteries, intricate designs that would be destroyed by wind and foot traffic within days, a meditation on the impermanence of life itself. In Michoacan, particularly around Lake Pátzcuaro and the island of Geneseo, the indigenous Purépecha people maintained all-night vigils in cemeteries, the grave sites illuminated by thousands of candles that turned the landscape into a sea of flickering light. In the Yucatan, Maya-influenced communities prepared a special dish called mukbipalo, a massive tamale cooked underground, combining ancient cooking methods with ingredients introduced by the Spanish. The 20th century brought new challenges and opportunities for Dia de los Muertos. Urbanization drew people away from rural communities where traditions had been maintained for generations. Migration to the United States created diaspora communities that struggled to maintain the festival in a foreign land. Yet the holiday proved remarkably adaptable once again. Urban families in Mexico City created ofrendas in apartment buildings, substituting where necessary but maintaining the core practices. Mexican immigrants in the United States began teaching their children about Dia de los Muertos, sometimes with greater intentionality than they might have back home, recognizing the festival as a vital link to cultural heritage. Universities, museums, and cultural centers in both Mexico and the United States began hosting Dia de los Muertos exhibitions and celebrations, exposing the holiday to audiences who had never heard of it. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Dia de los Muertos had achieved something remarkable. It had survived conquest, colonization, modernization, and globalization. It had spread beyond Mexico to become recognized worldwide, adapted by people of various backgrounds who found meaning in its central message that death does not sever the bonds of love and memory. UNESCO recognized Dia de los Muertos as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2008, acknowledging its profound cultural significance. The festival that began as an Aztec obligation, evolved through centuries of oppression and adaptation, had become a global symbol of how cultures survive, transform, and ultimately triumph over those who would erase them. The mystery of Mictlan, journey to the land of the dead and the 9 levels of the Aztec underworld. Deep beneath the world of the living, according to Aztec cosmology, lay Mictlan, the land of the dead. It was not a place of punishment like the Christian hell, nor a reward like heaven. It was simply where most souls went after death, a dark, cold realm ruled by the skeletal god Mictlantecutli and his wife Mictacacayatl. To reach Mictlan required a journey of 4 years through 9 increasingly difficult levels, each presenting obstacles that tested the deceased's determination and resilience. This belief system, reconstructed from fragments of surviving codices, Spanish colonial accounts, and archaeological evidence, presents one of the most fascinating and mysterious aspects of pre-Columbian spirituality. Yet much about Mictlan remains unknown, lost to time, conquest, and the deliberate destruction of indigenous knowledge. What we do know suggests a worldview radically different from our own, one in which death was not an end but a transformation, not a judgment but a journey. The Aztec conception of the afterlife was complex and nuanced. Unlike many religious traditions that divide the dead into categories of good and evil, virtuous and wicked, the Aztecs determined a soul's destination based on the manner of death rather than the quality of life. Warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth, considered equally brave and sacred deaths, went to the paradise realm of Tonexucan, the House of the Sun, where they would accompany the sun on its daily journey across the sky for 4 years before being reincarnated as hummingbirds or butterflies. Those who drowned were struck by lightning or died of diseases associated with the rain god, Tlaloc, went to Tlalocan, a verdant paradise of eternal spring. Infants and young children who died before they could be corrupted by the world went to a special realm where a great tree dripped milk from its branches, nourishing them until they could be reborn. But for everyone else, for those who died ordinary deaths from old age, illness, or accident, the destination was Mictlan. This was not a punishment. It was simply the natural order. Most people would end up in Mictlan, and the Aztecs approached this inevitability with a kind of stoic acceptance. Death was coming for everyone eventually, and when it came, you would need to be prepared for the journey. The journey to Mictlan began immediately upon death. The deceased was buried with specific items meant to aid them on their passage. A small dog, often as Aloyd Squintly, the hairless breed sacred to the Aztecs, to guide them through the rivers of the underworld, water and food for sustenance, jade beads or other precious items as offerings to the gods they would encounter. The body was wrapped and positioned carefully because the Aztecs believed the physical form of the corpse influenced the soul's journey. Family members would speak to the deceased, giving them instructions, reminding them of what lay ahead, preparing them for the trials to come. The first level of Mictlan was relatively simple. A crossing of a great river called Apanahuacalhua or Apanoyan, the place where one crosses the water. This was where the Zeloid Squintly Dog companion proved essential. The soul could not cross the river alone. The waters were deep and treacherous, and without the dog to guide them, the soul would be swept away, lost forever in the currents. Spanish friars who recorded these beliefs noted that the Aztecs believed the dogs would recognize their masters and help them across, which is why it was important to treat dogs well in life. A person who had been cruel to dogs might find no canine willing to assist them in death, and their soul would be trapped at the river's edge for eternity. The second level brought the soul to a place where two great mountains crashed together repeatedly. Teeped Monomictlan, where the mountains meet. The soul had to time their passage perfectly, rushing through the narrow gap when the mountains parted, hoping to make it to the other side before they slammed shut again. There was no clear explanation in surviving sources about what happened to souls that failed this test. Were they crushed, sent back to the beginning, trapped between the mountains forever? The mystery deepens our sense of how alien and unknowable parts of this belief system remain. The third level was a mountain covered entirely in obsidian, its stepital, the Obsidian Blade Mountain. Obsidian, volcanic glass sharper than modern surgical scalpels, was sacred to the Aztecs, used in their most important rituals and weapons. The soul had to climb this mountain, their essence sliced and cut by the razor-sharp stones with every step. It was a test of endurance, a painful ordeal that stripped away something from the soul, though exactly what was lost in this cutting is unclear from surviving accounts. The fourth level introduced the soul to its Siakayan, the place of the obsidian wind or the icy wind. Here, a freezing gale, sharp as obsidian blades itself, cut through the soul. The cold was so intense that it penetrated beyond physical sensation into the very substance of the spirit. Spanish accounts described this as a wind that could strip flesh from bones, though of course the soul traveling through Mictlan was already beyond flesh. The metaphorical or spiritual stripping that occurred here remains one of the enigmatic elements of the journey. The fifth level brought temporary relief, or perhaps a different kind of challenge. This was Paniketian, the place where the banners flutter, or sometimes translated as the place where people fly like flags. Some interpretations suggest this was a place of strong winds, where souls were tossed about helplessly, like banners or flags in a storm. Others suggest it was a test of the soul's ability to maintain direction and purpose while being buffeted by forces beyond their control. The ambiguity in the sources reflects how much was lost when the Spanish destroyed the detailed codices that might have explained these levels more completely. The sixth level was one of the most frightening, Timimonaloyan, the place where people are shot with arrows. Here, invisible archers fired arrows at the passing souls, piercing them repeatedly. The souls could not avoid the arrows, could not fight back against assailants they could not see. They could only endure, pressing forward despite the pain, despite the fear, knowing that stopping meant remaining trapped in this level forever. The arrow wounds were not fatal. The soul was already dead after all, but they were agonizing, adding another layer of suffering to the journey. The seventh level offered a different kind of torment, Teo Koyawoyan, the place where beasts devour hearts. Great creatures, perhaps jaguars or other sacred animals associated with death and darkness, roamed this realm. They would tear open the chests of passing souls and devour their hearts. But again, this was not final death. The heart would regenerate, only to be devoured again if the soul lingered too long. The imagery is visceral, terrifying, suggesting that the journey through Mictlan involved not just physical challenges, but psychological torments, confrontations with primal fears. The 8th level brought the soul to Izmiklan, Apokaloka, the narrow place, or the place where smoke resides. Some sources describe this as a region of suffocating smoke and narrow passages where the soul could barely squeeze through. Others suggest it was a place where the soul's essence was reduced, compressed, made smaller and more concentrated. A final transformation before reaching the deepest level. The smoke might have been literal, the volcanic underworld breathing its fumes, or metaphorical, the obscuring of the soul's vision and understanding as it approached the ultimate destination. Finally, after 4 years of traveling through these 8 levels, enduring all their trials, the soul would reach the 9th and final level, Chikino Mictlan, the deepest place of the dead, where Mictlantecuhtli and Mictlantecuhtli waited. Here, in the deepest darkness, in the coldest reaches of the underworld, the soul would finally rest. Not in torment, but in a kind of eternal peace, a stillness beyond the struggles of the living world. The soul would become part of Mictlan itself, joining the countless generations of the dead who had made this journey before. But what did it mean to rest in Mictlan? This is where the mystery deepens most profoundly. Spanish chroniclers, trying to understand Aztec beliefs through the lens of Christian theology, often described Mictlan as gloomy and undesirable, a place of punishment or at least deprivation. But Aztec sources, fragmentary as they are, suggest a different understanding. Mictlan was simply where you belonged after death. It was home, in a sense. The journey was difficult, yes, but the destination was not torture. It was reunion with your ancestors, integration into the eternal realm of the dead, a place beyond pain, beyond desire, beyond the constant struggles that defined mortal life. The offerings made during the Festival of the Dead take on deeper meaning when understood in the context of this journey. The family altar, the ofrenda, was not just a memorial to the deceased, but a way station, a beacon to guide returning souls who had completed their 4-year journey through Mictlan. The marigolds created a path of scent and color that the dead could follow back to the world of the living, at least temporarily, during those sacred days when the barrier between worlds grew thin. The food and drink offered were not symbolic but literal sustenance for souls who had endured unimaginable trials. The prayers spoken were not just remembrances but communications, updates on the living world given to those who had passed beyond it. Archaeological evidence supports the complexity of Aztec death beliefs. Excavations at the Templo Maya in Mexico City have uncovered elaborate burial sites with offerings that clearly correspond to items meant for the journey through Mictlan. Small dog figurines and remains of actual dogs buried with the deceased. Obsidian blades, perhaps meant to protect against or appease the obsidian mountain and the cutting winds. Food vessels and water containers. Jade beads and precious items. Each burial was a preparation for an ordeal, a loved one being equipped for a dangerous journey from which there was no return to the living world except during those brief, sacred moments when the dead came back to visit. Yet so much remains mysterious. How did the Aztecs envision the subjective experience of traveling through Mictlan? Was the journey perceived as taking 4 years from the soul's perspective, or did time work differently in the underworld? What happened to souls who failed the trials? Were the levels purely metaphorical, spiritual allegories for the psychological process of death and letting go, or did the Aztecs believe in them as literal places? The fragmentary nature of our sources, the destruction wrought by conquest, and the fundamental difficulty of understanding a worldview so different from our own all conspire to keep these questions unanswered. Modern scholars continue to debate the meanings embedded in the 9 levels of Mictlan. Some see them as representing stages of decomposition, the physical process of the body returning to the earth. Others interpret them as psychological trials, the soul's gradual release from attachment to the living world. Still others view them as cosmological metaphors, the soul's journey mirroring the movement of celestial bodies through the heavens and the underworld. The truth may encompass all these interpretations or none of them. The Aztecs themselves might have held multiple, even contradictory understandings simultaneously, comfortable with ambiguity in ways that modern Western thinking often struggles to accept. What we can say with certainty is that the Aztec conception of death and the afterlife was sophisticated, deeply considered, and central to how they understood existence itself. Mictlan was not an afterthought in their theology, but a fundamental component of their cosmology. The journey through its 9 levels was the destiny awaiting most people, and the Festival of the Dead was how the living maintained connection with those who had embarked on that journey. In honoring the dead, the Aztecs honored the journey itself, acknowledging the courage required to face death and what lay beyond. The mystery of Mictlan remains, in many ways, unsolvable. Too much has been lost, but perhaps that is fitting. Death itself is the ultimate mystery, and the Aztecs, rather than pretending to have all the answers, created a mythology that embraced the unknown, that acknowledged the strange and frightening nature of what comes after, that prepared people for a journey into darkness, while also promising that at the end of all trials there would be rest. In our modern world, where death is often hidden, denied, or sanitized, there is something profound about the Aztec willingness to confront it directly, to map the territory of the dead, even knowing that map would be incomplete. The 9 levels of Mictlan, with all their horrors and mysteries, remind us that death is not simple, not easy, perhaps not even truly final. The Festival of the Dead, which began as a way of honoring those traveling through Mictlan, continues today as Dia de los Muertos, still maintaining that connection between the living and the dead, still acknowledging that those who have died are not gone but transformed, still journeying, still part of the great cycle of existence that encompasses both life and death, both the world above and the mysterious realm below. The physical evidence of Mictlan's importance to Aztec society extends beyond individual burials. The Templo Mayor itself, the Great Pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, was cosmologically aligned to represent the Aztec universe in architectural form. Excavations have revealed offerings buried in the temple's foundations that include skeletal imagery, obsidian blades, and other death-related symbolism. The temple was not just a place of worship, but a physical representation of the cosmos, with Mictlan conceived as existing directly beneath it, deep in the earth. When priests performed ceremonies atop the pyramid, they were standing at the axis mundi, the center point where all realms, celestial, terrestrial, and underworld, converged. Spanish chroniclers, particularly Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who spent decades documenting Aztec culture in the mid-1500s, recorded detailed descriptions of death rituals that reveal how seriously the Aztecs took the journey to Mictlan. When someone died, their family would hold the body for 4 days, mirroring the 4 years the soul would spend traveling through the underworld. During these 4 days, the family would speak constantly to the deceased, giving them advice and encouragement for the journey ahead. They would describe each level of Mictlan in detail, preparing the soul for what it would face, arming it with knowledge that might help it navigate the trials. This was not mere superstition, but a sincere belief that the deceased could hear and benefit from these instructions. The role of the Zoloid squintly dog in the journey deserves deeper exploration, as it reveals the Aztec understanding of the relationship between humans and animals. These hairless dogs, which still exist today, though they nearly went extinct after the conquest, were not mere pets but spiritual companions. Families would raise them specifically for the purpose of accompanying souls to the afterlife. The dogs were sometimes sacrificed and buried with their owners, but more often, the belief was that a dog the deceased had cared for in life would meet them at the river and recognize them. This created a profound ethical dimension to how one treated animals. Cruelty to a dog in life might literally damn you to an eternity at the river's edge in death, unable to cross, unable to continue the journey. The Aztecs thus embedded moral behavior toward animals directly into their theology of death. The obsidian elements that appear repeatedly in the journey, the mountain, the wind, suggest the deep symbolic importance of this material in Aztec cosmology. Obsidian was formed from volcanic glass, born from the Earth's violent depths. It was the sharpest material available to the Aztecs, sharper even than modern steel, capable of creating wounds so clean they healed with minimal scarring. It was used in sacrificial ceremonies, in warfare, in surgery, and in craft. That the journey to Mictlan involved passing through obsidian barriers suggests that the Aztecs understood death as a cutting away, a separation that was both painful and necessary, a severing of the soul from the material world through a substance that came from deep within the earth itself, from a realm already associated with death and transformation. One of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding Mictlan concerns what happened after the 4-year journey was complete. Some sources suggest that souls who reached the 9th level simply remained there in eternal rest, but other fragmentary references hint at the possibility of reincarnation, that souls might eventually be recycled back into the world of the living in new forms. The contradiction in the sources might reflect genuine theological debate within Aztec society, different schools of thought about the ultimate fate of the soul, or it might reflect regional variations in belief, different city-states within the empire maintaining slightly different versions of the death mythology. We will likely never know for certain, but the ambiguity itself tells us something important, that the Aztecs, like people in all cultures, grappled with fundamental questions about existence and found no single simple answer. The Spanish destruction of Aztec codices represents one of the greatest intellectual catastrophes in human history. We know that the Aztecs maintained detailed painted books that recorded their history, astronomy, religious practices, and mythology. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of these codices existed before the conquest. Only a handful survived, hidden by indigenous people who recognized their value, and even these survivors are often incomplete or damaged. The information we have about Mictlan comes from these fragmentary sources, supplemented by accounts written by Spanish friars who interviewed elderly Aztecs in the decades after the conquest. These interviews were conducted through interpreters, filtered through Spanish assumptions about religion and the afterlife, and recorded by men who often viewed indigenous beliefs as demonic. That we know anything at all about Mictlan is remarkable. How much more might we know if the codices had been preserved? What details of the journey, what nuances of belief, what profound insights into the Aztec understanding of death have been lost forever? Modern attempts to reconstruct Aztec beliefs about Mictlan face this fundamental problem, working backward from fragments to try to understand a complete worldview. It is like trying to understand a complex novel by reading a few scattered pages. And even those pages are translations made by people who did not fully understand the original language or context. Yet scholars persist because what we can glimpse of Mictlan is so fascinating, so different from Western conceptions of the afterlife, so revealing of a culture that faced death with courage and created meaning from inevitable mortality. How the Aztec elite honored the dead, the nobility's festival, and the contrast with common practice. While common Aztecs endured the grueling physical and spiritual demands of the Festival of the Dead with limited resources and grinding poverty, the nobility of Tenochtitlan approached the same sacred obligation with resources and spectacle that transformed mourning into a display of power, wealth, and divine connection. The contrast between how the elite and commoners observed the festivals of Micéalhuitantli and Micéalhuitan Liahuit reveals as much about Aztec social hierarchy as it does about their beliefs regarding death. For the nobility, honoring the dead was not just a religious duty, but a political statement, a way of demonstrating their proximity to the gods, their control over material wealth, and their right to rule over the masses who struggled to scrape together basic offerings. Imagine being a member of the Pipiltin, the Aztec nobility. During the Festival of the Dead in the mid-1400s, your life, even in the midst of this sacred and solemn occasion, bears almost no resemblance to that of the Micéaltin, the commoners who make up the vast majority of Tenochtitlan's population. You live in a spacious stone palace complex, not a cramped adobe dwelling. Your daily meals include chocolate, a luxury reserved for the elite, along with exotic meats, fruits brought from distant conquered territories, and elaborate dishes prepared by servants. Your clothing is woven from the finest cotton, dyed with expensive pigments, decorated with gold ornaments and precious feathers from tropical birds. Even in mourning, even in the supposed humility required by the Festival of the Dead, your wealth is unmistakable. When the festival begins, your family does not create a simple home altar like the commoners. Instead, you commission a massive ofrenda that fills an entire room of your palace. The base is not woven mats, but finely carved stone platforms. The marigolds are not gathered from nearby fields, but are specially cultivated in private gardens or purchased in enormous quantities from the market, creating cascades of orange petals that flow down the sides of the altar like rivers. The food offerings are extravagant. Dozens of tamales, made not with simple maize, but with the finest ground corn mixed with precious cacao and honey, seasoned with vanilla and chili peppers imported from the coastal regions. There are whole turkeys, roasted and presented on elaborate ceramic platters created by master craftspeople. There are bowls of tropical fruits, pineapples, papayas, and guavas that most commoners have never tasted. The incense burning on your family altar is not ordinary copal, but the highest quality available, imported from specific regions, known for producing the purest resin. The smoke rises not from simple clay vessels, but from ornate censers shaped like the gods themselves. Vessels that are works of art worth more than a common family's entire yearly income. The candles are made from pure beeswax, not the tallow that gives off acrid smoke in commoner households. Everything about your altar demonstrates that your family has the resources to honor the dead in the most magnificent way possible. But the display is not confined to your home. As a noble family, you are expected to participate in the public ceremonies at the Templo Mayor with appropriate grandeur. When you process through the streets to the temple complex, you do not walk. You are carried in a litter borne by servants, shaded from the sun by elaborate parasols made of precious feathers. Your mourning garments, while technically conforming to the somber requirements of the festival, are still unmistakably those of the elite. The cotton is finer, the weaving more intricate, the subtle decorations more expensive. Even your suffering is more comfortable than a commoner's normalcy. The bloodletting rituals that torture common Aztecs are, for you, performed with finer instruments. Your maguey spines are specially selected for sharpness and straightness. They may even be tipped with gold or jade. When you pierce your earlobe or tongue, you do so with servants standing ready with the finest bark paper to catch the blood. servants who will then ensure the blood offerings are delivered to the temple with appropriate ceremony. The pain is the same, blood is blood, and suffering is universal, but the context transforms the meaning. For a commoner, bloodletting is proof of devotion despite poverty. For you, it is proof that even the wealthy and powerful submit to the god's demands. The fasting requirements also differ subtly but significantly. While commoners subsist on flavorless maize, paste, and water, you consume carefully prepared foods that technically meet the fasting restrictions but are infinitely more palatable. Your maize is ground finer, mixed with just enough flavoring to make it bearable without violating the prohibition on salt and chili. You have access to fruit juices and honey water to maintain your strength. You are still fasting, yes, but you are not experiencing the gnawing, desperate hunger that weakens the commoners around you. The most striking difference, however, lies in the human resources available to you. While a common family must divide vigil duties among a few exhausted relatives, you have servants who can maintain constant watch over your altar. You can sleep when needed, trusting that someone will keep the incense burning, the flowers fresh, the offerings protected. You participate in the all-night vigils at the temple, yes, but you know that your home altar is being tended by others. Your suffering is real, but it is not compounded by the practical impossibilities that torment common families trying to maintain sacred obligations while also surviving. The funeral practices for nobility also dwarf those of commoners in scale and expense. When a noble dies, especially a high-ranking noble or a member of the royal family, the funeral is an event that engulfs the entire city. The body is prepared by specialists who preserve it with elaborate techniques. It is dressed in the finest garments the family possesses, adorned with gold and jade jewelry, with a jade bead placed in the mouth to serve as currency in the afterlife. The offerings buried with the noble are staggering in their abundance and value. Not just a single dog figurine, but multiple actual Zeloite squintly dogs, sacrificed to accompany the deceased. Not simple clay vessels, but elaborate pottery, some pieces created specifically for the burial and never used by the living. Weapons, jewelry, textiles, rare feathers, cacao beans, which serve as currency, everything the deceased might need for the journey through Mictlan and for maintaining status in the afterlife. But the most controversial and striking aspect of elite funerals is the practice of human sacrifice. When a particularly important noble dies, especially a Tlatoani or high ruler, the funeral may include the sacrifice of servants, concubines, or even lesser nobles who are deemed necessary to serve the deceased in the afterlife. These individuals, often chosen because of their close relationship with the deceased in life, are killed and buried with their master or mistress. The practice, which horrified Spanish chroniclers, was understood by the Aztecs as an honor, proof that the deceased was so important that others would willingly follow them into death. Whether all the victims were truly willing is a question that haunts modern historians, but in the hierarchical world of Aztec society, refusal was likely not an option. The annual Festival of the Dead provides opportunities for the nobility to display their wealth and power publicly. Noble families sponsor elaborate feasts during the festival, not intimate family meals, but massive gatherings where hundreds of people are fed. These feasts serve multiple purposes. They fulfill religious obligations to honor the dead through generosity and community building. They demonstrate the family's wealth and ability to command resources. And they create or reinforce political alliances, as attending a noble family's festival feast is both an honor and an obligation, a way of acknowledging that family's status and creating reciprocal expectations for future support. The food at these elite feasts is extravagant beyond anything commoners would experience. Whole roasted animals, fish brought fresh from the coast through a relay of runners, exotic vegetables and fruits, elaborate drinks including pulque flavored with fruits and honey, and of course, chocolate prepared in dozens of different ways. The vessels holding the food and drink are themselves valuable, fine ceramics painted with intricate designs, some pieces imported from distant regions of the empire as tribute. After the feast, these vessels might be given as gifts to important guests, further demonstrating the host family's generosity and wealth. Entertainment at elite festival gatherings includes performances by professional dancers and musicians, elaborate costumes and masks, dramatizations of myths about the gods of death and the journey to Mictlan. Common families might have simple songs and dances at their gatherings, but nothing approaching the spectacle that noble families can afford. These performances serve educational purposes, teaching and reinforcing the mythology of death. But they are also pure display, proof that even in mourning, even in the solemn context of honoring the dead, the nobility maintains a standard of living incomprehensible to common people. The priests themselves, particularly the high priests who serve at the Templo Mayor and other major temples, occupy an ambiguous social position between the nobility and the commoners. Many priests come from noble families, but their office transforms them into something else, mediators between the human and divine realms. During the Festival of the Dead, the priests perform the most extreme acts of devotion. Their bloodletting goes far beyond what is required of lay people. They may draw cords covered with thorns through their tongues repeatedly, cover themselves in self-inflicted wounds, fast more completely and for longer periods. Their suffering is public and extreme, a demonstration that those who serve the gods most directly must suffer most intensely. Yet even the priests benefit from the hierarchy. The offerings brought to the temples, the food and goods contributed by both common and noble families, become the property of the religious establishment. The priests consume the food left on temple altars, wear garments woven from tribute textiles, live in quarters within the temple complexes that, while austere by noble standards, far exceed what commoners experience. The high priest of the Templo Mayor is one of the most powerful individuals in Aztec society, second only to the Tlatoani himself. His role during the Festival of the Dead is crucial, leading the major ceremonies, blessing the offerings, ensuring that the rituals are performed correctly so that the gods remain satisfied and the cosmic order is maintained. The Tlatoani, the supreme ruler of the Aztec Empire, embodies the ultimate connection between political power and religious obligation. During the Festival of the Dead, the Tlatoani performs ceremonies that no one else can perform, speaks prayers that no one else can speak, makes offerings that dwarf even those of the wealthiest noble families. When the Tlatoani honors his deceased ancestors, he is not just remembering his personal family but honoring all previous rulers, maintaining the chain of legitimate authority that connects him to the divine right to rule. His participation in the festival is both deeply personal and profoundly political. The Tlatoani's palace during the Festival of the Dead becomes a center of activity. Visiting nobles from across the empire present themselves to pay respects, bringing lavish offerings not just for the Tlatoani's ancestors but as tribute to the living ruler. The palace altars are so elaborate they become architectural features themselves, multi-level constructions covered in gold leaf, precious stones, rare feathers, and offerings that represent the wealth of an entire empire. Common people may glimpse these altars from a distance during public ceremonies, but they will never enter the palace rooms where the most sacred and expensive objects are displayed. There is something both beautiful and troubling about this contrast. The Aztec belief system holds that death comes for everyone, that rich and poor alike must make the journey through Mictland, that Mictlantecuhtli cares nothing for earthly status. In theory, the Festival of the Dead is a great equalizer, a time when all humans confront their mortality and honor those who have preceded them into death. Yet in practice, the festival becomes another venue for displaying and reinforcing social hierarchy. The noble can honor their dead with magnificence that the commoner cannot dream of matching. The suffering required by the festival may be universal, but the nobility's suffering is cushioned by wealth, servants, and resources in ways that make it qualitatively different from the bone-deep exhaustion and desperation experienced by common families. This contradiction runs through all of Aztec society. The empire is built on beliefs that emphasize cosmic order, the interdependence of all things, the necessity of every person fulfilling their role in the grand design ordained by the gods. Yet it is also a society of profound inequality, where birth determines destiny, where the elite live lives of luxury supported by the labor of the masses, where, even in the presence of death, the ultimate democracy, social hierarchies persist and are reinforced. The commoner is told that their suffering in honoring the dead is virtuous, proof of devotion. The noble demonstrates devotion through expenditure that displays power. Both are supposedly serving the same gods, maintaining the same cosmic balance, yet their experiences could hardly be more different. When the Spanish arrived and began dismantling Aztec society, they noted these contradictions with a kind of grim satisfaction. The conquistadors and missionaries pointed to Aztec inequality as evidence of the empire's moral bankruptcy, justifying their conquest as a liberation of oppressed peoples. This was, of course, deeply hypocritical given Spanish society's own extreme hierarchies and the brutal exploitation the conquest would bring. But it raises genuine questions about the Aztec system. How did common Aztecs view the elite's extravagant displays during the Festival of the Dead? Did they accept it as the natural order, the elite fulfilling their role just as commoners fulfilled theirs? Or did resentment simmer beneath the surface, hidden by fear and social pressure? We have no direct testimony from common Aztecs about their feelings toward elite practices. The sources that survived are almost all written from the perspective of the elite or the Spanish, neither of whom were interested in recording commoner perspectives. But we can infer from the rapidity with which the Aztec Empire collapsed after the Spanish arrival that many subjects, peoples, and even many common Aztecs in Tenochtitlan itself did not feel compelled to defend the system with their lives. When Spanish allied indigenous armies besieged Tenochtitlan in 1521, it was not just foreign invaders, but fellow Mesoamericans, people who had been part of the Aztec world, who helped tear it down. The Festival of the Dead, in its dual nature as both genuine spiritual observance and display of social power, encapsulated the tensions at the heart of Aztec civilization. It was sincere. The beliefs about Mictlan and the journey of the soul were real and deeply held by people at all social levels. But it was also a performance of hierarchy, a ritual that simultaneously proclaimed universal human mortality and reinforced the vast differences in how people lived, died, and were remembered. When this system was destroyed by conquest, when the temples were torn down and the public ceremonies banned, what survived was not the elaborate elite spectacle, but the core practices of common families honoring their dead with whatever they could afford, maintaining altars, making offerings, keeping memory alive. In a strange way, the destruction of the Aztec elite's power allowed the Festival of the Dead to become more genuinely communal, less a demonstration of hierarchy and more a shared human response to loss and mortality. The modern Dia de los Muertos, while it has its own hierarchies and its own displays of wealth in the form of elaborate ofrendas and expensive decorations, is fundamentally more egalitarian than its Aztec predecessor. Anyone can build an altar, purchase marigolds and candles, honor their dead regardless of social status. The Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century explicitly promoted this democratization, celebrating the aspects of indigenous culture that belonged to the people rather than to destroyed elite structures. La Catrina, the elegant skeleton lady created by José Guadalupe Posada, specifically mocks upper-class pretensions, reminding everyone that death strips away social distinctions. Yet even in its modern form, Dia de los Muertos retains traces of the old hierarchies. Wealthier families can create more elaborate ofrendas, purchase more expensive offerings, host larger gatherings. Tourism has added another layer, with some Mexican communities creating spectacular public displays of Dia de los Muertos altars and parades specifically to attract visitors, commercializing what was once purely a family and community practice. The festival continues to evolve, continues to reflect the society that observes it, just as it reflected Aztec societies, hierarchies, and contradictions centuries ago. The story of how the Aztec elite honored their dead reveals a truth about all human societies. Our relationship with death is never purely spiritual or purely emotional, but is always entangled with power, status, and resources. The desire to honor deceased loved ones is universal, but how we honor them, with what resources, in what style, these things are shaped by the societies we live in, by the inequalities we participate in, by the hierarchies we maintain or resist. The Aztec nobles who commissioned elaborate altars and sponsored massive feasts during the Festival of the Dead were no more or less sincere in their grief than the commoners who struggled to provide basic offerings. But their ability to express that grief, to demonstrate devotion, to ensure their own future commemoration, was fundamentally different, shaped by the accident of birth into privilege. As we drift toward the end of this journey through the history of Dia de los Muertos, from its origins in Aztec practice through conquest and transformation to its modern form, we are left with a complex legacy. A festival that began as a grueling obligation, differentiated sharply by social class, that survived conquest by adapting and syncretizing, that emerged in modern times as a more democratic but still evolving tradition, a festival that asks us to remember the dead, to honor memory, to confront mortality, but that also, inevitably, reflects who we are, how we live, and what we value in the world of the living. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams. And remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.